Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Hall. I'm the District Park Ranger with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. I'm honored to welcome you to Winter Wild, presented by the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. We are thrilled to have you with us and excited to bring you a full day of wonderful presentations on forest therapy, winter nature photography, bats, birds, and more. A reminder that due to today's weather, there's been a schedule change. Getting outside in the winter, an REI how-to guide is now from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, and birds of prey will be from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Because of our feathered friends are safely nestled at Mass Audubon, that presentation will unfortunately not be live. Before we get started, we'd like to know where you're joining us from. Please type your location into the chat if you'd like. You can also turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Without further ado, our kickoff presentation is titled Outside and Tuned In, the Health Impacts of Relational Forest Therapy. Forest therapy is part of a global effort to tend to the stressful conditions of living in modern industrialized civilization. Over the past few decades, there have been extensive research on the impacts of nature on human health and the importance of understanding the interconnectedness of life. From increased cerebral blood flow to stronger immune defenses, today we'll discover what happens when we unplug, slow down, and open our senses to our natural surroundings. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Tam Willey. Tam is a certified forest therapy guide, trainer, mentor, and teacher with the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. They are also the founder of Toadstool Walks, a guiding practice based in Boston, and co-founder of Acorn Programs, a business and practice development program for guides. Tam has guided forest therapy in collaboration with the Arnold Arboretum, Harvard University, and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, Mass Audubon, and the Peabody Essex Museum, and our Winter Wild partner, Boston Harbor Now, just to name a few. They are passionate about the ways that forest therapy can build collective empathy and compassion and broaden and heal relationships, both human and beyond. For more information about Tam and their work, check out toadstoolwalks.com. We will save questions until the end of Tam's presentation, but please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom, or using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window as they come up to you. Tam, the time is now yours.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, Boston Harbor Now. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today on this potentially snowy morning, depending on where you are in the world. I just want to invite us to just arrive and just take a moment to notice where we are. And maybe if there's a window nearby, to just look out the window and just kind of checking in with yourself, just noticing what it feels like to be you right now. Maybe just taking in your surroundings, the walls, just looking around your space and just bringing your attention to all of the different many beings who have and continue to tend these places where we are right now. So just wanting to take a moment to honor all those beings, all of the animals who are hunkered down in their burrows and who knows where. I'm sure there's another presenter that could tell us more all about that. But just with your imagination, just imagining all of the many animals and beings and rocks and streams and trees and just all of these places that inhabit the places that we're inhabiting. And so with that in mind and honoring all these beings, I want to acknowledge the Massachusetts and Pawtucket. I'm in what is modernly known as Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, neighborhood of Boston. and just honoring all of you for spending part of your morning being here with us today. So I'm gonna share some slides and tell you more about what forest therapy is. And I'm just gonna ask my moderator how my slides look and make sure I'm in full screen mode.
You are, your slides look great.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. So Alex introduced me and mentioned that I'm a certified forest therapy guide. So what does that mean? What is forest therapy? I always feel like I want to start with what it doesn't mean. So I'm not a therapist. I'm not a forest therapist. I'm not a counselor or psychologist. I'm a guide, and I guide people in this practice of forest therapy, which is a way of taking in the forest atmosphere. It's a guided 2 to 3 hour experience with a beginning and an end. And it's usually with a group of people, ideally with a group of people. And I offer various what we call invitations, which are open to interpretation. And we sort of wander around, come back together, and share as we're going through the forest. So this practice, I'm just going to go back and talk about the inspiration for this practice. I mentioned I'm trained through the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. Now, this association, I also work for them as a trainer. We train guides in this practice. And this practice of forest therapy is inspired by this practice of forest bathing. So you may have seen this word before. It's currently sort of an umbrella term for a lot of different practices. So I've seen it in different magazines and TV shows referencing all kinds of things, referencing mindfulness in nature or meditation in nature. I've even seen it used to reference like a way of hiking in nature, or different kinds of like eco psychology or eco movement. And the way that I know forest bathing is that it's this literal English translation of this term Shindinyoku, which was coined by the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries in 1982. And it was in response to this massive tech boom, burnout. So as people moved inside and became more indoors, long hours on screens, there started to be this collective effect of just poor health as a result. So in an effort to help support people's wellness and also to protect the forests around Japan, this concept came about. Now, nature connection and even more intentional practices of wellness in nature is ancient, as far back as humans began. So just want to name that, just give that disclaimer, like this is not a new concept, but this practice and this structured way really came about in the early 80s. And there's these designated forest therapy trails in Japan where you can go, and there's been dozens of forests that have been like measured on how they impact human health. So there's been all these studies where people are collecting saliva samples from other people who are going on these experiences, checking people's blood pressure before and after, and just measuring people's response to being in natural environments and resting in natural environments. And you can read, there's tons of these research papers online. You can read all about increase in certain kinds of white blood cells from simply breathing in these terpenes and aerosols that are released by certain trees in certain forests, and the impact of that on human health. And so all of this science has supported all this infrastructure around these forests. And now, we're feeling the tech boom all around the world, especially since the pandemic. Many people who've never been on Zoom before have been on Zoom. And we're, working more isolated for a time. It was scary to even go outside. So regardless of the pandemic, we've just sort of globally evolved to a point where many, many people are feeling this disconnect. So this science I mentioned, has showed all these different things that can happen as a result of spending time resting in nature. And there's some really great books that have been put out on this subject, on these specific things. And some of this stuff is really obvious. I know for myself, I take a walk in nature and I just feel better. I know if I'm really up in my head, or I've been looking at a screen, I'm scrolling social media, if I put my phone down and even look out the window, I feel a shift in my perspective, in just my experience of being alive. So my practice of forest therapy, it's inspired by forest bathing, but it does not seek to emulate Shindinyoku in Japan. And it's different. And I'm not a researcher. I don't collect saliva samples or check people's blood pressure before and after a walk. I'm interested in this science and it's important, but it's just sort of a piece of the practice of forest therapy, which is really about this intersection between the health and wellness and really the balance of all of us, not just humans. It's not about humans extracting the health benefits from nature. It's about relationships. And so with the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, we call our practice relational forest therapy. And some of that's in response to this is a growing field internationally. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And the way that my practice looks at it is through this lens of reciprocity and interconnectivity. So it's not just about what can I breathe in from these trees and how will that affect my immune system. It's also about what do I maybe have to offer these trees or this forest, that maybe there's something with my presence. And also because this is done in a group with other people, there's relationship, literal human to human relationship building and connecting happening. And so I'm just going to show you some pictures of various forest therapy programming that I've run. This is a picture from an immersion so part of the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, the biggest part of what they do is train guides to guide these experiences. And it's a 6-month certification program where you meet on Zoom with a group, you're part of a cohort for 6 months. And you kind of go on your own personal nature reconnection journey. And you also learn this particular standard way of guiding. You learn about our professional standards. And then at the end of that, you go on a 4-day in-person immersion and do the field work. You practice guiding through what we call our standard sequence. So it's, a beginning and an end. And there's this particular way that we approach this, which is agenda-free in principle. Of course, we're all human and we all have our expectations, but part of what we teach is just not projecting that onto other people and really inviting people into authentic relationships, meaning really encouraging people to connect in a way that feels good to them in their own way, without judgment. And some people cry, some people laugh. There's a lot of discomfort that can come up because part of what we're doing is inviting people into their bodies and to connect through their senses. And since many of us are a little disconnected from our bodies, or a lot disconnected, just even the simple act of bringing our attention to even just feeling our own hands, or touching a tree, or like just noticing what it feels like to just sit in the forest, can be a really big, intense experience, because it may feel like, wow, I have not been here for a long time. A lot of people have this experience of coming home. There's this homesickness that so many of us feel that's not necessarily tied to a home, like a structure, but a feeling of connecting, a feeling of belonging. And so it's the simple practice that actually brings up a lot of intensity sometimes, just because we have not maybe stepped into these kinds of relationships, maybe since we were a child for some folks. So it's really beautiful way of coming together, because it's unusual. It's really outside the regular, everyday, ordinary experiences many people have. I mean, some people have these experiences all the time, but for folks who come on these walks, these forest therapy programs bring all kinds of people. You cannot really categorize the type of people that go on these experiences as woo-woo or like tree huggers. Like, it's literally all kinds. And I've seen everything. I've seen everything from people who are in deep relationship with the earth, with the land, to people who feel like deeply disconnected, and coming back into those relationships brings up grief. It brings up fear. It brings up like, oh, I'm a human. I'm going to die. I have a body. And so it's really beautiful to share this. And the way that the walk flows is there's some time together and then there's some time apart. So people are sort of sent off to kind of wander. Sometimes they wander with a friend, or maybe the person they came to the walk with. And I offer some kind of invitation, some kind of sensory, like, go explore something. And then people just go do kind of whatever they want. They forget what I've invited them to do, and they just go get lost in space and time, and just have this simple 15-20 minutes to just be free. And then there's, a lot of resting. We don't go far, so it's not a hike. And I love hiking, but this is not hiking. This is like more like a spa in the forest. And I just emphasize over and over that there's no wrong way to do this, and people just do whatever they want. And then, we come back together throughout the time, and there's an opportunity to share what you're noticing, what's coming up. But you don't have to share. Not everybody does. And the shares sound like anything from, wow, I noticed the sun, the dappled light coming through the tree canopy, and it just felt peaceful, to sometimes people connect with a tree and then remember a deceased relative or ancestor, and grief comes up, and it's just sort of a space to be with whatever's happening and in your own way. And then at the end of the walk, we have a little forest tea party. Now, this is somewhat loosely inspired by more formal tea ceremonies, but it is not that. It's really just a way to end the walk, to incorporate this experience of like losing space and time, having left our ordinary everyday experience of what we know, and just kind of stepping out to the edge, to the fringe of maybe literally where we live, because we're going off into a park. We're not going into the deep backcountry. In fact, this practice really was designed to be accessible and not require special clothing or long travels or access to far away lands from our homes. It's really meant to be done just right in these peripheral places. So we end this walk with some snacks and some tea, And sometimes the tea is forage from the land if that's allowed and safe and all that. And then we just kind of like talk about how the walk was. And this is usually like at the beginning of the walk, if people showed up and they were like super tense and anxious and like, what is this weird thing that's going to happen? And maybe they're a little nervous. By the end, usually people are just like feeling kind of blissed out, might be more open to just talk to their neighbor if they weren't before. And it's really just kind of like some casual hangout time after the walk is ending. And these are some pictures from the Arnold Arboretum where I really started guiding these programs. And then I connected with Boston Harbor Now in 2019. I believe we started doing these day-long island ocean therapy retreats on Peddix Island. And this was just so fun. We would take the boat out early in the morning and we would spend the day, and I would guide different sections of the day, and then people would go off for a few hours on like a solo wander, and then we would come back and have this kind of festive island tea party at the end of the day and take the boat home together. And I really love working with the islands and the lands along the coast, because it really is this literal liminal area between the ocean and the land. And it has such an interesting history, especially around just a lot of it was this dumping ground of our city where we're not in connection with the land at all. And it was just like all of our waste, just that's where it went. And in the last 50 years, there's just been such an epic cleanup effort to make these beautiful places again. And yet they carry these rich stories of all of the different shapes these lands have taken over time. And this literally shows up on the beaches. And so like, this is just a picture of one of the beaches on Peddix after we did like a wander, and I invited people to like bring something back, that stuff they found. And we just created a little community creation here. And I just love seeing the quote human and non-human elements coming together and just literally showing that metaphor. And then cue the 2020 pandemic and Boston Harbor Now, there were no boats running to the islands. And I was like, well, what if we just did, what I usually do, which is these 2 to 3 hour programming. And we started doing that at some of the parks along the water. And so this has been my favorite place to guide. This is Webb Memorial State Park. And this was, I want to say this was like March or April. I mean, it was still pretty cold, but the sun was really warm that day. And this is on one of the beaches there. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful spot. And so people wander, and there's like these different beaches, and then there's also like these little kind of groves of like juniper trees and just all kinds of stuff going on there. In fact, the first time I went to Webb Memorial State Park and I was scouting these trails to plan for the program, I saw a full antlered buck run by. Now, I'm someone who's done a ton of hiking in New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont. This is in Weymouth that I saw this buck. I rarely see that, like when I'm hiking in the White Mountain National Forest or up in Maine in the preserves. I've seen some, but like this was in Weymouth, and this Webb Memorial State Park, it's a peninsula. It's a pretty small spit of land, and there is just so much wildness and wildlife happening there. And it's just been an amazing experience to get to invite people into relationship with this place that's part of their neighborhood or right down the street. And so many people, they're like, I never knew this was here. And I never knew it was there. And I grew up in this area. I went to Nantasket Beach as a kid. I'd never heard of or been to Webb Memorial State Park until I was looking for places to guide ocean therapy themed walks with Boston Harbor Now. And so there's just so much green space there. So again, I just want to acknowledge like all the different things that happen on these walks, and it's anything from just relaxing, like people are just like, I don't have to do anything right now, which is pretty radical for folks who work a lot or have a lot going on. It's definitely is for me. And part of the reason I got into this work is because of this feeling of just disconnect, honestly, disconnect from myself, from the world, from society. And what I've learned from training guides in this practice and guiding these programs is that this experience of feeling disconnected or feeling like you don't belong or just feeling weird or awkward or different, unique, this is not a unique experience. And a lot of people who come through the guide training program have the ultimate luxury of extra space and time in their life. And they're still suffering. They're, you know, a lot of people are just suffering from this disconnect. And not to say like, you know, a 3-hour forest therapy walk is going to cure that. I think there's so much that we need for our wellness and our health. But one of the most inspiring things I've witnessed is this coming together across so many different experiences. And particularly, I just want to shout out to Boston Harbor Now. I've had such diversity of all kinds come on my walks. Their promotional reach is so big that I've just had so many different kinds of people from different backgrounds come together. And one of the beautiful things about the practice is we're just there being earthlings. It doesn't really matter beyond that. Like we're able to come together and share the experience of like what a branch feels like, and that we can do that regardless of our stories that we hold. And part of this practice is honoring all of our stories, that there is no wrong story or wrong way to be, which is not the case in a lot of our experiences in the tamed everyday world. So part of that liminal space is metaphorical too. It's like we're just sort of like leaving some of these parts of ourselves and just being in our flesh and blood. And just the simplest act of doing that can just bring a lot of free experiences. So part of what we're doing is just remembering that we were created and that we are tethered to this earth. And a lot of times just leaving our homes and turning off our phones and walking in a local park can just remind us of parts of ourselves that we may have forgotten. And so as a guide, I'm not offering those reminders. I'm not doing any of that. We like to say that the forest is the therapist and the guide opens the door. And that door is to the senses. So basically, I'm just guiding people back into their bodies, just reminding them of like touch, sight, hearing, smell, taste, or whatever you got. And just like, let's bring our attention to that and get out of our heads and just sort of be in this experience of being an earthling. So I think I'm going to leave it there and pass it back to you, Alex, for questions.
Okay, Tam. Wonderful presentation. And as I said earlier, you have an opportunity to ask some questions of Tam about the presentation. And you can do that by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and typing in your question. I see we have a couple questions already. You can also hit the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen if you want to ask your question live. I'll kick things off, Tam. I've got a sort of a question. Have you found sort of a difference between, I would imagine that sort of forest therapy would be great in sort of a team building or a workplace situation. I had the pleasure of doing a forest therapy walk with some coworkers on Grape Island about 4 or 5 years ago. And I can imagine that there's probably a different dynamic as a guide for you in interacting with people who, again, might already know each other, besides maybe, oh, I brought a friend, I brought my partner, I brought my spouse, I brought a family member, versus people who, again, already know each other because they're there either from a club or a work situation. Have you found any, in your experience as a guide, any sort of differences in working with different groups like those?
Those are my favorite groups to work with, actually. It's interesting how even if you've maybe been working together for years, or your classmates, or you have this other kind of everyday or common way of knowing each other, there's stuff that comes up on these walks that's just like so surprising sometimes. And there's this intimacy that's different. And even just with a community walk with like maybe sisters, siblings, sisters, friends, spouses, I've heard people like, they'll share something when we come back from the different invitations, and the person that's known them for like a really long time will say, I didn't know that about you. And that's just super moving to me. And actually, you're just reminding me of one of the most moving walks I guided right sort of last spring, when there was this moment of like, maybe the pandemic is ending. There was sort of this moment where the cases were way low, and a lot of people were just starting to like feel safer going outside. Mask mandates had been lifted, at least outside. And someone had contacted me to guide a private walk for her and her friends. She was turning 60, and her husband and like a bunch of their friends, all these married couples, they had all met in college. They were all like around in their 60s. They'd all raised their kids together. And for the whole time they've known each other, they've always had dinner together every Friday night. They're like in a book club together. They're really deeply connected, this group of friends. And during the pandemic, they started Zooming. And they started Zooming, regularly, but they hadn't seen each other in the longest time that they'd not seen each other. I mean, many of us have had that experience. There was something unique about this group of friends. So anyway, this woman reached out, asked me if I would guide her group of friends for her birthday. I think there was maybe about 12 of them or so. And we met in the Arnold Arboretum. And it was just so moving because a lot of them hadn't seen each other, maybe beyond like a wave from across the street at that point. And I got to see them all greet each other with a hug for the first time in, however long it had been at that point. And then, we took our mat. It was the first time I guided a walk where we weren't wearing masks. And now, these people knew each other really well. Like I said, they'd been friends since college. They'd raised their kids together. Their kids were probably like, some of them were maybe my age. And they were just shocked at hearing each other. And part of the way that we share during these like sharing opportunities is this very like one at a time, like just really listening. It's not a conversation. We sort of go around, and anybody who wants to can say something small. And of course, my experience of this beautiful group of people is they were just like interrupting each other the whole time. And then what they reflected back to me at the end was they were like, we've never listened to each other so deeply before. We've never really taken turns talking like that. And so like, that was just really cool that for them, that was like such an amazing kind of like sharing circle moment, where for me, I was just like, wow, this group of friends, like they're just so wild and chaotic, and they're so excited to talk. And there was a lot of reflections of, oh, I didn't know that about this person, or just people just feeling really moved. So that's what comes to mind. But I absolutely feel like this is one of the best team building, get out of your other environment that you're used to being in, and to just see what happens. And I think even just getting out in nature, even if it's not with a guide, but getting your office or your coworkers, your class, just out of that room, out of the office, out of the classroom, makes such a difference. But yeah, those are my favorite groups to guide, because it's like, what else is there that you didn't know, that you might not find out in a different environment?
Great, thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth. She asks, when you are guiding a forest bathing experience, how do you create space that enables people who are looking to connect quietly, privately, with the many emotions that may be triggered that might take someone, might make someone super vulnerable? How is trust established?
So a lot of the invitations are done by yourself. In fact, I like to say at the beginning of the program, like, we're going to go for a walk alone together, and there'll be some time together and some time to yourself. And everything's optional. So even when we come together and it's like, so what are you noticing? And there's this opportunity for sharing. Not everybody shares. You can pass. And yeah, a lot of people walk off. The invitations last between like 15 minutes to a half hour at a time, depending, sometimes longer. And during that time, a lot of stuff comes up, because the forest, the ocean, the desert, the land is the ultimate witness. We don't, that's where we go to cry. I mean, like, another guide colleague of mine, who's also a grief specialist, a grief counselor, talks about how like the forest doesn't offer you a box of tissues. And we're always sort of like unpacking like whether or not to hand someone a tissue when they're crying. And I don't have a right answer. I think there's great hospitality in being handed a tissue when I'm crying. But at the same time, it also, I'm like, oh, let me clean myself up and pull myself together. And so it's sort of like this, like, how do you hold space for people to actually really welcome whatever's happening? Because in our everyday tamed world society, we can't really let it rip. We can't just let ourselves sob whenever we feel like it, because it's just, it's scary. We're so afraid of grief. The forest is not. The ocean does not care. The ocean's like, bring it to me. Give me your tears, fill me up. So, in terms of how that's facilitated, I'd say half of the 3-hour experience is by yourself. Probably more than half of that time is by yourself. And yeah, I just, as guides and as a guide trainer, we just like to say it's all welcome. Whatever is happening for you, like, let it happen. And just modeling that myself as a guide, if whatever's happening for me, just trying to be myself and be real in the moment with whatever's arising.
Well, great, thanks, Tam. Yeah, I know, I recall from my personal experience with forest bathing that, it's hard to think of many activities that I think most of us can participate in, where it's both a group activity, but also very, very personal. I think of like going to, some type of art presentation, the theater, watching a movie, even a sporting event where, yes, it's a group activity, but and we might talk about it, but we're sort of all talking about the same thing and not necessarily making it very sort of personal. And I think, you know, for forest therapy, forest bathing is I wouldn't say a unique activity, but certainly one of those sort of can't think of really much other activities that I'm aware of where, again, you have the experience to talk as a group and to share, but also make it very personal at the same time. So I encourage people, if they have a chance to go on a forest therapy walk, a forest bathing walk, to check it out. It was very eye-opening for me. We do have another
Thanks,
question.
Alex.
Well, we do have another question from this is from Christina. How did you become involved with forest bathing and certification as a guide?
That's the hardest question for me, but I'll just say, like, you know, I learned about the term and the practice and what was happening in Japan in 2016. I have had a meditation practice and was involved with a local meditation place that was doing a program in the forest. And I went thinking that we were going to do like sitting and walking meditation in the forest. And that's not what happened. And the meditation teacher introduced us to this term forest bathing, Shindinyoku, told us what was happening in Japan. And it just really was fascinating to me. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I've spent most of my adult life self-employed as handy tam, officially or unofficially retired my tool belt at the beginning of the pandemic. And around that time, I was just sort of burnt out on doing that and just looking for more deeper connections with people. And I was also just noticing how stressed out people were that I was working for. I was, as a handy person, I've been in many, many, many people's homes and just kind of like witnessed to this kind of underside of people's lives. And seeing just the burnout of this everyday grind. And I'm just like, there's got to be more than this. Like, what's the point of fixing your house if you aren't enjoying your house because you're working all the time to pay for it and you're actually never home? And so I'm like, I want to explore this. I want to find a way to connect with people that doesn't start with their problems or doesn't start with what's broken, but just starts with just this shared intersection of I'm alive, you're alive. What about that? So anyway, I just kept looking for opportunities to try forest bathing, and it was very new growing field here, so there wasn't really a lot out there. And then I found the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, and that they had created this 6-month certification guide training program. And I was like, I am signing up for that. And it just kind of turned my life around. And they were a new organization. They were growing really rapidly. And I was able to get involved because they were growing. And it's just been amazing being associated with them because I've gotten to witness people on their own guide training journey. And it's just gone from there. And I think because of my background being self-employed, I just have that like energy or motivation to like create and make things happen. I've built my own websites a few times. I've, marketed and promoted myself, mostly hanging flyers on telephone poles around my neighborhood, like local handy person and wants to rake your leaves. And then, just sort of like took that skill set and I was like, I'm going to be a guide and I'm going to bring this to my neighborhood and to my friends and my people, and connected with the Arnold Arboretum, where I've been visiting since the late 90s when I first moved to JP. Totally never heard of it, took it for granted, mostly just bombed down Bussy Hill on my skateboard for years until I was like, wow, there's other paths here, there's trees here. And even though I'd been visiting the Arnold Arboretum for 10 years, all of a sudden it was like this brand new place to me because I was just really slowing down to pay attention. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, sort of about what it's not, I mentioned it's not a hike. Like, we don't go far on these programs. It's like maybe a mile, because there's a lot of sitting and resting. And if you're trying to get people to like get somewhere, it's like herding cats because everyone's so like blissed out. So it's not that, and it's also not a naturalist walk. So while as guides, we have naturalist knowledge, meaning we know what poison ivy looks like, we're aware of ticks. If we're guiding in bear country, we have some bear awareness training or understanding. But I'm not out there identifying tree species and teaching people about bird language. That's like another scope of practice, another way. We're really not teaching people about the forest and the ecology. We're really just guiding people into their own like curiosity and wonder, and kind of like taking a break from like naming. So just wanted to mention that also.
Great, thanks so much. We've got a few minutes left. If anyone has a question that they haven't had a chance to type in, please do so now.
There's one in the chat, if you can see that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, I see it. So Tam, do you guide people to use all 6 senses while they're in the forest?
The short answer is yes, and beyond. So if you've ever explored the senses and other cultures, other languages, there's like many more beyond these basic 6 that we reference, or basic 5, I'll say. And then this 6th sense, I feel like, has a lot of different definitions depending on what lineage or culture you're looking at it from. But we explore a lot of different senses beyond these basic 5, and not everybody has a sense of smell, or can hear, or can see, or can, even, our sense of touch like is so different for everyone. And beyond that, like there in the training, definitely to be a guide, we study different senses like proprioceptive sense and interoceptive sense, which is like the sensing of like your organs, your internal sensations of like, I have to go to the bathroom, I'm hungry, versus like gravity, where am I in space, that sort of sense exploration. We talk a lot about the imaginal sense, which is sort of triggered by like seeing, like you're maybe touching some moss, and then that just kind of like brings some other world, some thought, some journey that you go on in your imaginal sense. We talk about the heart sense, or our body radar, and just being like being guided by that, being able to really tune in to these other ways that we're sensing, this other language that we have with our bodies. So the beginning of the walk starts with a guided going through the different senses, and then beyond that, the invitations are sort of like different for everybody. I think sometimes people come back and share, wow, the smell of these pine trees, it was just so delicious. Where someone else was like, wow, I was touching this bark and it just felt so craggy, or the water was cold, or I felt pain in my heart thinking about my grandmother who died last year. So yes, and beyond.
Great, we've got a couple more questions. We'll try to get these in. The next question is from Rachel. How do you change your guiding based on different lengths of walks? For example, 1 hour compared to full days.
So the full experience really needs like a 2-hour minimum to really like chill out our like nervous systems. However, I've definitely been invited to classrooms where there's like, we've got 45 minutes, what can you do? And I'll, do something similar to this. I'll sort of talk about what it is and maybe guide us through just one invitation, which usually an invitation can last between 15 to 20 minutes, where I'm offering some kind of prompt and then you're going off and seeing what happens from there. And then we come back and share, and depending on the size of the group, sometimes that's really short, especially if people don't have a lot to share, or if it's with a bigger group, you know, sometimes that can be a little longer. So yeah, it can always be modified, but I'd say to really have the full forest therapy experience, like minimum 2 hours, 3 hours is ideal. And, you know, again, with Boston Harbor Now, when we did these full island day-long retreats, which maybe hopefully we'll see if we can do them again this year, next year, you know, this is a full day thing. And the feedback from that is just incredible, like what people experience being able to spend a whole day, like not plugged in, not having to do anything, but just be a person. So.
Great, thanks, Tam. And I know we've got one more question, so we're going to sneak this in. This is from Roxanne. She's wondering if you guide for mixed age groups or groups for young people, such as teens.
Definitely yes to teens. I personally don't guide children, but I have worked with youth in Boston for 10 years. I do really like to work with young people. But children, I feel like, is like another sort of skill set. That's just, there are a lot of guides who specifically work with kids in like forest schools. For me, I'm just much more interested in, like, I would say from age like 15 up, because that's about when we start to like lose some of that playfulness and lose that connection, start forgetting those parts of ourselves that feel more connected to the land. And that's just personally my ideal, is like youth and adults.
Great, thanks so much. Well, again, thank you, Tam, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for attending. As I said, you know, I went on a forest therapy walk just a few years ago, and I had not heard of this prior to that. So I think it is a new sort of opportunity. I wouldn't say necessarily a new concept, but a new opportunity for a lot of us. So I hope that this is something that I know you, Tam, have done for the Harbor Islands and other places in the area. So I would certainly encourage people who are on this, who've been attending this presentation, to look at opportunities to come along with Tam and others in the park and also in local open spaces around them. So again, thank you, Tam, so much for your time on this topic.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Boston Harbor Now, and thank you everyone for tuning in on this snowy morning, and be careful if you're shoveling today.